to the beginning of Heschel's life. He's born January 11th, 1907, a descendant of the great Hasidic masters, including, amongst others, the Maggid of Mezrich, who became the leader of Hasidism after the death of the Baal Shem Tov, and who brought the teachings of Lurianic Kabbalah into Hasidism. Probably the greatest of the Hasidic figures, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. I was surprised in the news the last few days that nobody talked about Berdichev because it's right outside of Kiev. It's right where all the action is happening now. His great-grandfather, the Abt Rav, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel of Apatov, in Polish, which in Yiddish is Abt, who was buried next to the Baal Shem Tov. And Rabbi Israel of Rizhin, one of the leaders of Polish Hasidism. He was seen as a child prodigy and a prince in the Hasidic community, with all the makings of a great Hasidic leader, a destiny that he decided to reject in his teenage years. His father was Rabbi Moshe Mordechai Heschel. If you go to Warsaw today, you can visit his grave in the Great Jewish Cemetery in Warsaw. His father had a small Hasidic court in Warsaw. His father, though, died of typhus in 1916 during the First World War. Now, what was Heschel's name? And where did it come from? His great-great-grandfather was, as I mentioned, was Abraham Joshua Heschel of Apatov. It's the same name as that famous Hollywood producer, Jed Apatow. The same name as the after that town, yeah. The first person with a name close to that in that family was the chief rabbi of Krakow in the 17th century, Joshua Heschel of Krakow. If you go to Krakow, there's a cemetery next to the Ramah Synagogue. You can see the grave there today. Somewhere along the way, one of the Joshua Heschels became sick. And as was the custom in those days, they added a name to confuse the angel of death if he was dispatched to take him. And they added the name Abraham. So that's how it became from Joshua Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel. And by the time you come to the 19th century, with his great-great-grandfather, Abraham Joshua Heschel of Apatov, you have the whole name. But the Heschel we're talking about, his name is really Abraham Joshua Heschel Heshcel, because he's named after his great-grandfather, Abraham Joshua Heschel of Apt, but he's the son of Moshe Mordechai Heschel. So Heschel was both his middle name and his last name. So his correct name was Abraham Joshua Heschel Heshcel, which is why many of the people who were close to him, including his wife, always called him Heshcel, because it was his middle name. Now, let me give you a sort of insight into the world of learning out of which he came. And I want to do this as he would do it, in terms of the story. When I became engaged to his not my current wife, I mean the only wife I had had a long time ago. When we became engaged, she was going to New York on a business meeting, for a business meeting, and she'd always been a big fan of Heshcel, and she wanted to meet him. So I said, okay, I'll arrange it. But you have to take my advice when you go to see him. She said, what advice? I said, well, there's certain things you have to know. I said, first, if he asks you, he's going to ask you if you know something about something. Never admit you know something. Because he knows more. And he's going to show you how much you don't know about what you just said you know. So never say you know something. Only say, I've studied something. Secondly, he's going to ask you what I'm researching now, what I'm doing in my research now. So I'm going to write down for you what I'm doing. And at the time, I was researching for a monograph on a rather obscure figure in 16th century Germany, who was the brother of the famous Rabbi Judah of Prague, whose name was Rabbi Chaim ben Bezalel of Friedberg. I was searching for a monograph on him. And I said, if you take those two pieces of advice, if you know what I'm researching and you don't admit to knowing anything, you should be all right. So she goes to New York, gets to his office, knocks on the door. He opens the door, and out plummets plumes of smoke from these enormous cigars. And he invites her in, and the first problem is where to sit down, because there are books and papers everywhere, on all the chairs, on all the tables, on the floor, everywhere. So he spends some time cleaning up a chair. She sits down. So he says, yes, how I am, fine, blah, blah, blah. Asks why she's in New York, tells him. Then he says, do you know music? So she remembers. Don't admit you know anything. So she says, well, I studied music. So he says, well, I've been trying to figure this out for a long time. Let me see what you think. Haydn. Do you think Haydn's music is English or German? He says, I've discussed this with many famous musicologists, and I don't know if they're correct. I want to see what you think, because you studied music. And she says, I think Haydn's music is more British than German. And he gives a big smile, takes 14 puffs out of the cigar, and says, you're right. That's what I think. Why don't these musicologists understand this? Then he asks what I'm working on. And she says, he's working on this person, never heard of him, Rabbi Chaim ben Betzalel of Friedberg, the brother of the Maharal of Prague. Remembered all that. And he said, you know? And he takes out a paper and he writes down from memory all his works. Well, here's what he should read. This is what he wrote. And then he says, you know, when I first read Chaim ben Betzalel of Friedberg for the first time, I had a lot of trouble understanding his work. Is he, meaning me, is he having a lot of trouble understanding it? I don't know, I didn't ask. First time I read it, I had trouble understanding it. And she said to him, Dr. Heschel, when did you read it the first time? And he said, I mean, seriously said, not as a joke. He said, I think maybe I was 6, maybe 7, maybe 5, but around then. I found it very difficult. And this was straightforward. So this is the world of scholarship he's coming at it. That's why the Leva quote could never be true. A guy who's reading Chaim ben Betzalel of Friedberg at 7 years old, who's already been through half of the Talmud, knows the Bible almost by heart, knows all these Hasidic teachings and everything else, isn't going to be, going to a cheder studying about the binding of Isaac. So this is the world of scholarship, he's coming out of. The world of erudition he's coming out of. The Jewish world he's coming out of, which is very distant from the world we're in, here. But is the lens through which he is seeing the world we're in here. And therefore, when studying his works and thought, you have to see that from that perspective. Only now, Professor Tov Marmer of Hebrew Union College, who wrote his dissertation on Heshcel, has published and has analyzed Heschel's first writings, which were when he was a teenager, on dialectics in the Talmud. He was publishing stuff on his Talmud of Talmudic studies when he was a teenager in Warsaw. And only now I haven't read them yet, I haven't even seen them yet, but that's where he's coming from. I mention this because we have to see this in juxtaposition from where we are here today. Marmer he's giving a course right now, this semester at Hebrew Union College in California. And he gave his students an assignment in his Heshcel course. The assignment was interview someone who knew him. So I get a call one day from this young woman who wants to interview me, who's in that class. Third-year rabbinical student. I thought I was talking to a 7-year-old illiterate. It's so awesome that you studied with Heshcel. She starts off. Tell me about how awesome it was. This is an interview. I said, what have you read? Well, I couldn't read his Hebrew work, so Rabbi Marmer translated it for us. This is a third-year rabbinical student. She can't read his Hebrew work. I said, did Rabbi Marmer discuss his use of phenomenological method? What? So I don't know what they're teaching today in rabbinical schools. And you compare this to the world out of which he came, and you apply the litmus test of authenticity. What do you come up with? You know? Now, when he was in the late teens, Heshcel, I would say, surrendered his destiny. His destiny being becoming a Hasidic master, and took off for Lithuania, particularly to Vilna, where he enrolled in what in Europe was called at that time a gymnasium. We call it today a high school. Because he wanted to go study at the great German universities. But in order to study at the great German universities, you had to have what would be in this country today the equivalent of a high school diploma. He never had gone to school. It was at private tutors. So he went to Vilna, where there was a famous Yiddish gymnasium, which catered to secular Yiddish poets. And some of the greatest Yiddish poets, some of them later killed by Stalin, were students there with him. And it was there that he studied the subjects that met the requirements to get the gymnasium diploma. He had to study some things in science. He had to study German, Polish, and mathematics and history, minimally, to qualify for the gymnasium certificate. And because it was a Yiddish gymnasium, he also, of course, had to do stuff in Yiddish language and Yiddish literature and stuff like that. He became there part of a circle of poets called the Young Vilna Poets, Young Vilna, and began to write Yiddish poetry. And today, those poems were published in 1933 in book form when Heshcel was 26, but they have now been translated and published in English. And you find in the poems many of the images that you later find become central to his theological work. For example, the God in Search of Man, theme is very prominent there. The theme of divine pathos is very prominent there. And even terms like palaces of time, which he uses in his book, The Sabbath, are already found there. And the name of this book in Yiddish is Der Shem HaMeforash, Mensch. The ineffable name of God, human beings. In other words, the human beings are the ineffable name of God. So there is not this sharp dividing line between the divine realm and the human realm. A rather revolutionary idea, because that was always the big polemicizing issue between the Jews and the Christians. The medieval Christians were always attacked by the Jewish polemicists on the idea of the incarnation. Because the incarnation erased the line dividing the divine and the human, which was basic to Jewish thinking from the time of the Bible. But which, again here, in Kabbalah, that line is very ambiguous. So again here you see the influence of Kabbalah. And if you look even further, if you apply certain methods of numerology to the name of God, the ineffable name of God, which is what he calls the book, the Shem HaMeforash, if you spell out the name of the letters, Yud He Vav He, like Yud is Yud, Vav, Dalet, and you count up the numerology, it equals 45. Yud He Vav He. If you write out the names of each of those four letters, not the letters themselves, which is 26, but the names of each of the four letters, Yud He Vav He, you'll get 45, which happens to equal the word Adam, which is human being. So again here, you always have with Heshcel these hidden, Kabbalistic, obscure hints going on. So when he calls his book of Yiddish poetry, the Shem HaMeforash, Adam, colon could mean also an equivalency sign. The Shem HaMeforash is the Yud He Vav He. You spell out the names of the letters, you get 45 equals Adam, man, human being, is also 45. Shem HaMeforash Mensch. Now the current translation of the poems is by Rabbi Morty Leifman, but there was an earlier translation, which might interest some of you, which is very hard to get. I have a copy somewhere, which was done by Zalman Schachter. And Mrs. Heschel didn't like the translation, so she refused to allow it to be published. But the early version was translated by Zalman Schachter, who some of you know. What differentiates the poems from that of his contemporaries in the Jung Vilna group is the religious themes, because most of the poets, except for him, in the group were very secular. As I mentioned, you find many of the themes of his later work already in these poems. one of Heschel's readers of the poems, of course he didn't read it till 1930, was the greatest Jewish poet of those times, who was Bialik. And we know that in 1930, while Heschel was a student in Berlin, Bialik wrote to him, "I anticipate your greatness and I believe in you." Well, that's a good review. After spending 3 years in Vilna, Heschel goes in 1927 at the age of 20 to Berlin. And he enters the University of Berlin and he has to choose what we call today a major. You know, in Europe it's a little bit, it's much different. Guess what he chooses?
Philosophy.
That's the third choice.
Okay.
The first choice is art history. Then after that, he chooses psychology, then philosophy, and then finally Semitics. While he's studying at the University of Berlin, he also enrolls in a place you wouldn't expect him to enroll, and that is at the Heshcel für die Wissenschaft des Judentum, which is the liberal Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin. In America, we might say the Reform Seminary, but it wasn't really Reform in the American sense. It was a little further right-wing than American Reform. You might have expected that he would have not enrolled at all in rabbinical school. You know why? Because he already had a rabbinic ordination from the time he was 16. So he didn't need another one. Or you might expect that he would enroll in the Orthodox rabbinical school in Berlin, the Hildesheimer Seminary. But he didn't. He enrolls in the Heshcel, the liberal seminary, where you have a very stellar faculty, including the great leader of German Jewry, Leo Beck, who was teaching there at the time homiletics. In Berlin, he is exposed to German culture, music, art, and literature. And he is exposed to the great German Jewish scholars, including Leo Beck, and the other faculty at the Hochschule, like the great historian and successor to Heinrich Gretz, namely L. Bogen, who is known today more for his book on Jewish liturgy than for his books on Jewish history. The great historian of Jewish philosophy, who later goes to Hebrew University, namely Julius Gutmann, and the great authority and editor and author of the, not author, but editor of the classical edition of scholarship on the Mishnah, namely Hanoch Albeck. Heschel becomes very close to a scholar in Germany by the name of David Koigen. Koigen's field was what they used to call in those days the sociology of knowledge, epistemological sociology. And Koigen was interested in the link between creativity, ethics, religion, and the need to develop a philosophical anthropology. The relationship of epistemology, which is the study of how we know what we know, to a person's political, social, and moral action. So you can already see an anticipation of themes that later coalesced in Heschel. In those days, in the 30s, 20s and 30s in Germany, the dominant force in German Jewish thinking is the thought of Hermann Cohen. Hermann Cohen was the great expounder at the University of Marburg of the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. But Heschel, following the influence of Huygens, becomes a rebel in his rejection of Kant's approach to philosophy and Kant's quest for objectivity and Kant's notion of morality called the categorical imperative, namely that there are universal moral laws. And instead, following Huygens' influence, Heschel becomes influenced, already then in Germany, by an American thinker, little known in Europe at that time, by the name of William James, and particularly his book, still in print today, called Varieties of Religious Experience. And Heschel therefore develops the idea that what is of ultimate significance is not the idea, but rather the experience. And therefore, what we need to do in order to penetrate the meaning of religion and the meaning of anything is not to analyze words and ideas, which was what philosophy was mostly about, universal ideas, but rather to analyze what happens in the consciousness of the religious personality. And this leads Heschel eventually in the 1930s to focus his doctoral dissertation on what happens in the consciousness of the prophets. Not in taking the prophets as expounding abstract universal ideas, even abstract universal moral principles, or what Kant would call the categorical imperative, which was the approach of most Protestant scholars in Germany in those days, but rather to examine what goes on in the consciousness of the prophets and to understand the phenomenon of prophecy rather than placing the prophets in pre-existent categories or defining prophecy itself. So Heschel was not interested here in what philosophers have been interested in since Socrates, namely how do we define something? How do we define universal moral character? But he's interested in the experience, and particularly what's happening in the consciousness of the person who has this experience. And I'll come back more to this later and how this dovetails with Heschel's use of the method of philosophy developed in the 20s and 30s called phenomenology. But for now, suffice it to say that this approach that Heshcel embraces already in his book on the prophets demonstrates his break, not only with the dominant approach of German Jewish scholarship at the time, namely the Kantian or Neo-Kantian approach, but also demonstrates his break with Koiden, his mentor, because he rejects the validity of sociology, claiming that the sociologists are wrong in that everything is not determined by the culture in which one lives, but rather that it is possible for individual creativity to oppose cultural norms, and by implication also cross-cultural norms, which came in opposition also to the views of most of the other social sciences. And this leads him to introduce a concept that becomes central to all his thinking, and which we'll come back to a number of times, and that is what he calls in Who is Man, the category of the unique. Namely, that the sciences are trying to take many things and put them all under universal categories, and to look at the world under universal categories. And what that does is that obscures the uniqueness of things. That the scientific approach tries to universalize everything, which obscures the unique. But the approach of the religious consciousness is built on what he calls the category of the unique. So, for example, you don't take an event like the revelation at Sinai, if you're a Jewish theologian, and you try to fit it under some kind of pre-existing category of epistemology, or transmission of knowledge, or cross-cultural exchange. Rather, you begin with the assumption that the event at Sinai is unique. You don't try to take every human being and put them under a universal category. Rather, you say, yes, human beings have certain things in common, but as the Talmud puts it, every human individual is unique. That's the category of the unique. Not putting everything under a universal category. Now, when I was an undergraduate, it was very popular, especially for Jewish students, to major in sociology. But I remember I was a sophomore, Heshcel asked me, so what are you majoring in? I said, I'm thinking about sociology. Everybody was doing sociology then. And he said, no, don't do that. Do philosophy. I said, why? He said, well, what's sociology? It's journalism with footnotes. So this was all part of his rebellion against his mentor, Koiden. And all of this also relates to another idea which I introduced before and we'll come back to again, namely the idea of polarity. Because on the one hand you have the category of the unique, let's say every individual is unique. On the other hand you have the community. So you have the polarity of the individual and the community. I would suggest, and Heshcel discusses this at some length, that one of the big problems we have in the American Jewish community is that all you hear about is the community. You don't hear about the individual. You don't hear about how the community should serve the religious strivings of the individual. all you hear about is how the individual should support the community. Everything is about the community. Nothing is about the individual. I read something the other day where it said, it was a mission statement of a synagogue, and it said, the purpose of our synagogue, the mission of our synagogue, is to give meaning to the lives of our individual members. Now, I've spent a lot of time and written a few books on this whole question of what is the idea of the meaning of life in Judaism. What is Judaism view as the meaning of life? And one of the things I just found out when I was researching these books is the reason I wrote them was because no one had done it before. In other words, you have all these studies, sociological studies and demographic studies, about the Jewish community, the rate of intermarriage, how many people light Shabbos candles, how many people make krepla, soup, and all these ridiculous studies about the community. But what is being done to tell the average individual Jewish person why is Judaism a way of giving their individual life meaning, and what Judaism has to say about meaning for the life of the individual Jew? Everything is the community. Especially if you read the propaganda put out by Jewish federations, everything is the community. We are one. As I remember it, the verse says God is one. It doesn't say we are one. I guess they uncovered that in the Federation School. Now, in 1929 and 30, academic year, Heshcel meets the leading Jewish philosopher in the world at that time, we discussed a little yesterday, namely Martin Buber. And a little more on that later. There was a hand up here somewhere. Yeah, please.
I was going to ask you to repeat that statement, everything is not determined by the culture in which one lives, but...
But that there is a possibility for individual creativity against the cultural norms. You have to understand that the dominant view of scholarship in those days, let's say study of the Bible, must understand the biblical text within the context of the cultural norms of the ancient Near East, let's say of Assyrian culture. So Heshcel is arguing that what we find in the biblical era, let's say like Hebrew prophets, cannot be understood simply either as a development out of or as a rejection of or a polemic against, let's say the religion of ancient Assyria, but rather as a unique, spontaneous expression of a religion in and of itself. And this gives you a totally different idea of the world. The late Professor Samuel Sandmill of Hebrew Union College wrote an article many years ago called Parallelomania, in which he argues that one of the big problems with contemporary scholarship, especially Jewish scholarship, is that Jewish scholars are always looking, when they see something in the Jewish world, particularly things they don't like, they say the Jews took it from the non-Jews. So they want to find a parallel in the non-Jewish world to what we have in the Jewish world, especially the things they don't like, because then they can say they came in under alien influence. My friend, the late Rabbi Louis Jacobs, used to say, if you took out of Judaism everything that came in under parallel influence, outside influence, you'd have precious little left. So there was obviously outside influence, but why did they take certain things and not other things? And are all the things, which was Sandmill's point, are all the things that scholars claim were taken from the outside, really taken from the outside? Or were they just parallel developments, where two cultures created the same thing at the same time? Or why can't we assume that they took it from us rather than we took it from them? Why can't we assume that? And my friend at Hebrew University, the leading scholar in Kabbalah, Moshe Del, has now published a number of studies showing that many things that for years scholars argued with Jewish ideas taken from the non-Jews actually took from us. For example, I don't want to get into the details, but take something like Gnosticism. Gershon Shalom and his group argued that early Jewish mysticism was all taken from Christian Gnosticism, and that Christian Gnosticism informed the whole development of Jewish mysticism. Edel comes along and he says, well, why can't we assume that the earliest Christian Gnostics took their Gnosticism from the Jewish Gnostics, and it all, derives from Jewish stuff? Why do we have to assume the Jews took it from them? Just because you didn't like it, Shalom didn't like it, or somebody didn't like it. Why can't we assume the opposite? And Heschel's arguing it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where it came from. You have in logic what's called the genetic fallacy, which is another way of saying it doesn't matter where it came from in terms of establishing its validity. For example, if you bring someone in, if someone walks in the door right now who you know and I don't know, and you introduce me to this person, and so I go over and I put out my hand to shake his hand, and he says, oh, I don't do that handshaking business. Not because he's one of these, has a phobia, which I know people who have, shake hands like that. He says, no, this handshaking, that all comes from the knights in the Middle Ages, and the Vikings, and used to have knives up their sleeves, and, that is to show I don't have a knife up my sleeve, and, it's obsolete and all this, and he doesn't want to shake my hand. Well, that's the genetic fallacy. I'm not shaking your hand to show you I don't have a knife up my sleeve. Of course, I lived long enough in Chicago that I don't know what people have up their sleeve. They just passed the concealed gun law. You can have a gun. You don't know, but it's a show of friendship. It's a show of, greeting. It's a show of all kinds of things. Not that you have a knife up your sleeve. That's a genetic fallacy. So it doesn't really matter. What matters is what meaning do we put to it today, not where its origin was. And this is something that people don't really think about, because they say, kashrut, that was before the FDA. Now that we have the FDA, we don't need kashrut anymore. I would say, precisely because we have the FDA, we need kashrut.
More questions?
There was another,
Yeah, what's puzzling me is something you went over pretty quick, and maybe you're coming back to it, but when you said that Heshcel surrendered his destiny, and I'm puzzling about why that is, and I'm thinking that this thing that came up a little later about kind of a sociological determinism versus a unique individual, that those are maybe connected, because he broke out of this Hasidic world that he was born into and born for in some way, and came out to talk to the kosher pigs in America.
Well, he didn't expect to ever be in America at that point.
Right.
But, it seems very clear that he found his destiny too stifling.
Did he write about that?
Yeah.
I think there are some hints in the poetry, but not really, no. Because when you write something and you publish something, you're exposed. It can be used against you. So he was, very, at certain points he was very careful. Later, another story, but at certain points he was careful. You don't want to shut off certain possibilities, especially if you want to expand your purview.
Seems like he was a unique individual in the Hasidic world, and a unique individual in Vilna. And
Well, another way, that's true, but there's another way of putting it, and the other way of putting it, he was out of place everywhere.
Yeah, that's what
But that didn't seem, it did bother him. But the comfort was, there's a famous Hasidic saying, how does it go? Mi she'eino makom b'shum makom yesh makom b'kol makom. A person who has a person who has no place anywhere has a place somewhere. So I think that, that's what but he definitely felt, out of place everywhere.
Isn't that part of his uniqueness?
Well, that's what he said. I'm just saying that's the flip side of it. And if you stand, outside, you have a different perspective. You have a more objective perspective and a more critical perspective. And that's what often got him into trouble, that critical perspective. But I think that in a sense, Kaplan is right, though I don't want to agree with him, but I have to admit he's right, that we find in Heshcel a certain level of obsequiousness, where he's trying very hard to fit in and sort of trying a little too hard, and it becomes obvious. When you see, for example, his letters to Huber, trying to get a job at Hebrew University in the 30s and get out of Germany, when he probably knew that the Hebrew University was run by this German Jewish mafia and there was no chance that he would get a position at Hebrew University. Or when he writes to the president of Hebrew Union College, Morgenstern, Julius Morgenstern, the letters are very serious. But, if you're stuck in Nazi Germany in the 30s, you'd be obsequious too. So you see all of these, he's not a simple guy. There's a lot of complexity going around. They just had that big conference in Washington Obama had about fatherless boys. And, they grow up. I found it sort of interesting because Obama had no father and Clinton, the last Democratic president, had no father. And they seemed to do all right. But Heshcel grew up basically, he had many father figures, but his father died when he was 9. So he basically grew up without a father. And so there's a lot of psychological complexities, and on the one hand things came easy to him, but on the other hand things did not come easy to him. For example, finishing his doctorate, as I discussed yesterday. It wasn't his fault that Hitler took over Germany in the meantime. It made it a little difficult to finish a doctorate on a Jewish subject at a German university. It's nothing in his purview that, he grew up during World War I, and Poland was, in the middle of everything. Not that, there were troops running through Poland killing people as they did in World War II, but still, a strange place to be in, and that, the whole country was dismantled before World War I. And the position of Jews in Poland at that time was very ambivalent. So, he had all this stuff going on. And then to come to a country so foreign, and especially where the Jewish community is so foreign from anything he experienced before when he came here, and having to adjust, coming during wartime, being here during the war, getting on mostly by speaking German, in Cincinnati during World War II, and a strange combination of things, but that's where it is. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Idel in the Gnostic. Do you know what book that was in?
Say that again?
Idel, and seeing that the Gnosticism may have come from the Jewish sources. What book that he was in? Where he
I can't hear you. Idel?
Idel, and you talk about his Gnosticism, and
Yeah.
where is that in Idel? Do you know?
I don't remember. My guess is it's probably one of his students wrote that book. I'm sure you find it in his writings, but I don't think he really developed there. I'm sure you find it in Kabbalah and the Perspectives, but probably not developed. Idel came up with a lot of theories, and when he started to produce PhD students, he assigned many of them for their dissertations to flesh out his theories. Like, for example, he came up with the theory, again against Sherwin, that Lurianic Kabbalah was not a reaction to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Sherwin's whole theory is based on this, that it was a reaction to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, that all of Lurianic theology is a reaction to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Idel says no. Now, how do you prove that? He says, well, it's easy to prove it. You go through Luria writing, the writings ascribed to Luria and his disciples, and you try to find some mention of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And so he assigned different of his students different works by Luria's disciples to find the reference. So far, nobody's found it. Now, I don't buy it. Just because nobody said it explicitly, I mean, even if nobody ever wrote anything about the Holocaust, you can't say that the Holocaust didn't influence the next few generations of Jews in terms of how they thought about certain things. So I just, even if they didn't mention the expulsion per se, I don't think that proves that they weren't influenced by the expulsion. But he has a lot of ideas like this, and the idea of influence is one of them. But I really can't think of any of his individual works where he discusses this. So my guess is that he has it in Kabbalah and Perspectives, and it's developed by somebody else. I got it, just from talking to him about it. He didn't mention where he was writing about it, or maybe he didn't even write about it then, or maybe he didn't write about it at all. I don't know. There was another hand somewhere, yeah.
His focus on experience more than words and abstractions, and his focus on what you call categories of the unique rather than universal and all that. Isn't that deeply Jewish and in contrast with the Greeks? I mean, what I'm really getting at is you mentioned how much he got from William James, varieties of religious experience. But hasn't Jewish tradition long focused on both of those things? I'm trying to find out how much he really was indebted just to James, or James' work massaged these aspects of Jewish.
Well,
in contrast to the Greek philosophers.
I think you're right. Namely that, of course, he knew that these ideas were Jewish, but when you're a young foreign scholar, as he was in Germany in the 20s and 30s, and you're taking on basically the whole German Jewish intellectual establishment by rejecting neo-Kantianism, and when you're rebelling against your own mentor, in the case of David Kogan, what are you going to use to justify your position? You're not going to say, well, I grew up in this Hasidic background and I knew all this stuff from there. You can't say that. You have to fight with the same armaments that they're using, which are modern armaments. So James, I guess, was the best ammunition he had. Maybe not terrific ammunition, because in Germany at that time they didn't think very highly of American thinkers or of American scholarship, but that's what he had.
So my impression of this was that he was using philosophy to talk to the sort of philosophers, using their language in part to take them to another more authentic Jewish space beyond philosophy.
Well, in Who is Man, it's a very highly polemicized work, and he's polemicizing against philosophers, and the big issue he's polemicizing against in there is against categorization and affirming this idea of the category of the unique as the basis for dealing with the question that in Europe they call philosophical anthropology, which is the philosophy of human nature. So he's taking the position that the philosophers, beginning with Socrates, began with the question of what is man, which was a search for a universal definition. And that the reason they never really come up with a satisfactory answer is because they're asking the wrong question. And the reason they're asking the wrong question is because they're trying to fit human beings under a pre-existing category like animal, and then ask the question, what kind of animal? Are they different than other animals? But denying or rejecting or not taking into account the category of the unique, which for him is the primary category.
And part of authentic Jewish, that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, because again, this is his major, what the existentialists call a project. Jean-Paul Sartre said, Jean-Paul Sartre, the great French philosopher and great existentialist and also phenomenologist, but atheist, has as one of his major issues, like all the existentialists, what is the meaning of human existence? Well, if you knock God out of the picture, which he did, what becomes the basis of individual meaning? For Sartre, the basis for individual meaning is given to you, or you acquire it, by engaging in what he calls a project, which is your life's work. And that project is what you see as the basis for the meaning of your life. So, this is where Heschel's coming at it too. So it's, beginning with the question of individuality and meaning, rather than the question of, well, what kind of zoological species is the human species? What's the adjective you use to modify the verb animal? And in Who is Man, Heschel says in the history of philosophy, there were three approaches. One is to define the human being. They were all to define the human being. One was to define the human being as a kind of animal, like Aristotle, the rational animal, or like Marx, the tool-making animal. One was, which he calls the zoological definition. Then there's the mechanical definition. Human being is a kind of machine. And the question is, what kind of machine? And that comes out of the French 17th century philosopher Lemaitre, comes after Descartes. And then you have the Marxist view, which is that the human being is a kind of commodity, which I would say is probably the dominant view today, that the human being is a kind of commodity. What kind of commodity? And Heshcel says, well, the problem is if you begin with the attempt to define, then you're going to, it's the wrong question, you end up with the wrong answer. And you have to ask, well, what are the, once you come with an answer, what are the moral implications of that answer? And he discusses some moral implications, let's say, of defining human beings as commodities. It's morally disastrous. And all of this is based on how you ask the question, and why the Jewish way of asking the question, the category of unique and all this, is not only an alternative view, but a better view. You know, I don't want to sound too much like my late teacher, Max Kadushin, who always used to say, I'm a Jewish intellectual chauvinist and proud of it. But in my view, you know, Jews have to ask themselves the question, it's my view, is Judaism superior to other ways of looking at the world or not? And in particular, is it superior for us who are Jews? And if it's not, then what's the rationale for remaining a Jew? It's hard to find one, I would say. And so I know it's politically incorrect to say today that anything is better than anything else, but I think that Heschel's position is, and I think he says it very clearly in a number of his Yiddish interviews with the Yiddish press, that the world is a mess. I mean, he says it point blank after the war. The world is a mess. It has no guidance. It doesn't know where it's going. And that's because its thinking is all wrong. And that's because its thinking all comes from this Western tradition, which is rooted in the philosophy of the Greeks and the Germans. And what we need is an alternative, and we have it, and they don't. So why don't they take what we have? Because it's not only better for us, and it's not only better, it's better for everybody else, too. That's basically his view, though he doesn't, you know, knock people over the head with it. And that's basically my view. So that's why the question of what is authentic Jewish thinking becomes so central to him. Because this is the best answer we have to deal with the problems we have, because the other ways aren't getting us anywhere, except in big trouble. You know, but people today don't want to, you know, they don't want to give gold stars to the good students because the other people might feel bad. Well, I don't care if they feel bad. It's just going to make their lives better. Mr. Gonzalez, did you have a question?
Was he also rebelling against the study of Semitics? Were they using like Greek categories to define Judaism and study it as well?
No, he wasn't rebelling against the category of Semitic studies as it was in Germany then, which was using what was called the philological historical method, but believed that the goal, that the means became the end. In other words, that the goal of study, of Semitic studies, was, let's say, to understand the Bible, or let's say to understand the Talmud or something like this. But if all you did is focus on the philological structure of the words, you never got to the goal. The goal became the understanding of the words, not the meaning of the words and what are the implications for life today of the words. It's just the words in themselves. So if you discover that some Hebrew word comes from an Akkadian root or a Ugaritic root or something like this and originally meant something else, unless it leads you to a useful insight, for now, it's pointless.
Yes.
I mean, if I understand the Babylonian creation myth in Akkadian, the Maelish, that's very nice, but so what? How does that help improve my spiritual life, or how does that help improve my society? But if it leads to my having a better understanding of something, then it reaches its goal. And his issue was, let's say, take the Psalms. Because in the Psalms you have many influences of Ugaritic words. So if you understand the Ugaritic roots of some of the words in the Psalms, does that help you achieve the goal of saying the Psalms? Let's say when somebody is sick, there's a custom to say the Psalms. So if you know that in the 23rd Psalm, there's a word comes from a Ugaritic root, does it help you? You're sitting at somebody's bedside saying the 23rd Psalm with them and they're sick. Does it matter to the patient whether the word comes from a Ugaritic root? Sometimes it might. But if you focus only on the philological issue, you don't get to the point. In other words, take the 23rd Psalm. There's that phrase, the Hebrew word salmavet. It's always translated the shadow of the valley of death. Salmavet. We know that this comes from an Akkadian root that means deep darkness. Actually, Rashi already said it, even though he didn't know Akkadian. It means deep darkness. So if a person is in deep darkness, they should still have hope for divine redemption. That's what it means. There's no such thing as the valley of the shadow of death. They thought it was from two Hebrew words, Sal and Mavet, meaning the shadow of death. Not where it's from. So this helps the person, because when you're, say, in a hospital bed, you're recovering from surgery, you're very sick, you're in a situation of darkness, you want to come to a situation of light, you're in a situation of unredemptive, you want to come to a situation of redemption, while you're in illness, you want to come to health. So it makes sense. But if you just, are examining it and leave it at that, and not deal with its implications, it's meaningless. There's another hand here somewhere. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Akkadian.
Pardon me?
I'm not familiar with that word, Akkadian.
Akkadian is ancient Babylonian. It's an ancient language which was written and spoken in what is today part of Iraq, and the word Akkadian comes from the capital of the kingdom of Assyria in the ancient world, which was Akkad. That's why it's called Akkadian.
Okay, and does it predate Hebrew?
Oh yeah, it predates Hebrew, and Hebrew was definitely influenced by it in certain stages. Are there any other questions? All right, then I think we'll take a 10-minute break. Is that good? All right. Yesterday I discussed with you the process by which Heshcel got to get his book on the prophets, his dissertation published in Krakow, and to finally get his PhD where I might say job prospects are even worse than in America today. For Jews to get a job in academics in Nazi Germany and the universities were not terribly good. As I mentioned to you, he financed the publication of the prophets by using his advance from writing in German a biography of Maimonides in preparation for the 800th anniversary of Maimonides' birth in 1935. And I want to say a word about the Maimonides book, which is out in English translation. But before that, let me just mention that in 1934, Heschel is ordained by the Heshcel. Not that he needed one, because he already had ordination as a teenager in Warsaw. But as a graduate of the Heshcel, that opened certain doors later on, particularly at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, which saw itself as sort of the American parallel to the Heshcel. Now, in order to meet the deadline for completion of the Heshcel book and the Maimonides book and getting the money in hand in time to pay off the Polish publishers, Heschel spent 7 months working night and day to finish the Maimonides book in order for it to be published in time for the anniversary of Maimonides' birth in 1935. Copies of the original German book, we have a copy in our library somewhere. This book is extremely rare because this was one of the books which was on the list of books to be burned by the Nazis in 1935. So very, very few copies of the original German edition survive. Now, just as Heschel took a unique approach to the study of the prophets by rejecting a sociological approach, a philosophical approach, a philological approach, a sociological approach, a cross-cultural anthropological approach, and takes rather the approach of examining the consciousness of the prophet through phenomenological analysis, which I'll come back to. Similarly, in his book on Maimonides, Heschel takes a rather unusual approach, unusual compared to the approaches being taken by other scholars who are writing to commemorate the 800th anniversary of Maimonides' birth in various languages. In that rather than focusing on Maimonides' thought, Heschel focuses rather on what he calls Maimonides' inner life. In other words, what's going on in Maimonides' consciousness, or to put it in more contemporary terms, what makes Maimonides tick? And how is Maimonides' thought related to his deeds? And why, in his later life, does Maimonides seem to make a shift from scholarship to social action, particularly from philosophy to medicine. How, not so much how Maimonides expresses his philosophical ideas, but why and how does Maimonides respond to living a life in exile? Remember, Maimonides and his family leave their native Spain and wander around until they finally come to Egypt. And what? In other words, Heschel asked the same question about Maimonides as I asked about Heschel. What is the organizing principle, or as Sartre would say, the project of his life? And here, Heschel comes up with a very unusual response, which he unfortunately never really developed further enough. Heschel argues that Maimonides, who lived at a time when the Jews were in exile from the land of Israel, including himself, and himself being in the worst possible place for a Jew to be in exile, namely the place we all got out of, namely Egypt. And Maimonides living at a time when revelation is no longer available. Prophecy has ceased. And according to rabbinic tradition, Ein nevuah chutz la'aretz, there is no prophecy outside of the land of Israel anyway. At such a time, Heschel says, Maimonides aspired to prophecy. And that's the organizing principle of his life. How to acquire prophecy. Now, Heschel is asking this question while he's still putting the finishing touches on his book, The Prophets. And probably because he's doing that, he reaches another conclusion. And that is that Maimonides' view of prophecy does not meet the criteria of Heschel's own project, which is what is authentic Jewish thinking. Namely, that Maimonides' view of prophecy is not a Jewish idea, that the prophecy Maimonides wants to reach is not that of Jewish prophecy. So this leads us to two obvious questions. One, what was Maimonides' view of prophecy that he wanted to reach? And two, how did he want to get there and why? Let's deal with the second question first. Heschel, in the 50s, so this is 15 or 20 years after he's writing his book on Maimonides, published a study in Hebrew called, it's translated to English now by Morris Firestein, E'emin HaRambam Shezacha Linvuah. Did Maimonides aspire to prophecy? And his answer is yes, he did. That Maimonides wanted to become a prophet, to achieve prophecy. Now, we know from Maimonides' Igeret Teman, or Epistle to Yemen, Maimonides says, I have a family tradition that the Messiah will come eventually, but before the Messiah can come, prophecy has to first be restored as the prelude to Messianic era. the Epistle to Yemen is about a false Messiah, a Jewish false Messiah who arises in Yemen. So he talks there a lot about prophecy and messiahs. He says, and I have a tradition that prophecy will, from our family, that goes all the way back to the time when they were expelled from Jerusalem, which means the destruction of the Second Temple, first century. I have this tradition that prophecy will be restored, and prophecy will be the prelude to the Messianic, the possibility of the Messiah coming, and that prophecy will be restored, I forget the exact year, it was something like 1216. Now, Maimonides probably figured he would be alive by then. I mean, he died in 1204. It might have been 1210, I'm not sure. It was around there, but he might have made it, or believed he would make it. And the way I read Maimonides is like this. At the end of the Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides says there are 4 levels of human perfection, or human development. So what he calls perfect, I won't go into this in any detail, but he calls the lowest one perfection of possessions, in the need a modicum of economic security in order to go to the higher perfections. Then perfection of the body, which is physical health, and that's where all his medical stuff plugs in. And then what he calls moral perfection, the 3rd level, and he defines moral perfection as the removal of vice and the inculcation of virtue, just like he defines perfection of the body or medicine as the dispelling of disease and the inculcation of health. And then there's the highest level, the 4th level, and that's what he calls intellectual perfection. Intellectual perfection means knowing the right ideas. And intellectual perfection, he says, is the prerequisite for prophecy. That only if you've attained all the levels through intellectual perfection can you then have the possibility of becoming a prophet. And in his definition of prophecy, prophecy means the touching, the proximity of the human intellect with the divine intellect. And the more touching you have, the greater a prophet you are. And Moses, of course, has the most, so he's the greatest prophet. That, in a nutshell, is Maimonides' notion of prophecy. So prophecy is ultimately an intellectual experience. Yeah.
Is that Maimonides' definition, or is that a classical Jewish definition?
No, that's not. That's the exact opposite of a classical Jewish definition. And if you want the classical Jewish definition, that's what he has in the prophets, which we'll discuss in his book, The Prophets. So he says, look, Maimonides aspired for prophecy. He thought prophecy would be restored before the Messiah could come. Remember, he's living during the Crusades. The Jews are disenfranchised. Everybody else is claiming their land, the land of Israel. And it will all work out when the Messiah comes. So everybody all the Jews want the Messiah to come. But the Messiah can't come until prophecy is reestablished. And prophecy doesn't just happen, pish-posh. We have to take responsibility for attaining levels of intellectual perfection. And to do that, we have to do the prerequisite levels of perfection. And then if you reach a high level of intellectual perfection, you can. You don't have to. It's not guaranteed, because God has to also will it, because otherwise you'd be forcing God to make your prophet. You can't do that. But you become a candidate for prophecy. And prophecy then can be restored. And Heshcel, in his Hebrew essay, argues that that was what Maimonides' goal was for himself. And that's why he writes the Guide of the Perplexed, to set down the correct thinking. And the reason he writes his Mishnah Torah, which is his code of Jewish law, how you behave, that's to attain moral perfection, which is the right action. And that's why he practices medicine and writes all his medical stuff, because that's how you attain the perfection of the body, which is the second level. So if you attain all the levels, you go up the ladder of human perfection, you attain intellectual perfection, and then you become a candidate for prophecy, and he wanted to do this himself, and that was his project, and that's the organizing principle of Maimonides' life. And when you attain prophecy, what's revealed to you is what transcends the capabilities of reason, because prophecy, I don't want to get into details here, but prophecy is also related for Maimonides to what he calls the imaginative faculty of the soul, an idea he gets from Aristotle, and not only the intellectual. So, for Maimonides, prophecy, besides everything else it accomplishes, leads you to knowing yourself, which is, of course, what philosophy is all about, since Socrates visited the Delphic Oracle, that you know yourself through your relationship with God. And this is all in fulfillment of a verse in the Chronicles, where we are commanded to know God. Spinoza took this idea and developed what he called in Latin the amor Dei intellectualis, the intellectual love of God. This is the goal of human endeavor, to attain the intellectual love of God. Now, Heshcel, in his biography of Maimonides, tries to examine how Maimonides went about this, given all the obstacles in his life. I mean, if you're sitting in a room in an ivory tower somewhere, it might be easy to attain this idea of prophecy. But he raises the question, how did Maimonides do it? First of all, he had to deal with the problem of the exile. He had to deal with the problem of the Crusades. He had to deal with the problem of being a refugee. He had to deal with the problem, which for him was a major problem, as we know from his writings, of the death of his brother, who was lost in a shipwreck, with all of their family possessions, and who was the person closest to him. And since all of the family possessions were gone, Maimonides had to put it simply, get a job. Because in those days, especially in the Sparta communities, I don't know if Dr. Merriman is dealing with this in his course about Spartan and Ashkenazim, but the Spartan have a long-term tradition that they don't pay rabbis. That it's against Jewish law to pay rabbis, because it says in the Ethics of the Fathers you shouldn't use the Torah as a shovel to dig. So they don't pay the rabbis. The rabbis always have a real job. So Maimonides needed a real job, even though he was the rabbi of the Jews of Egypt. So he went out and became a physician. Maimonides has to deal with the question of how to bring the Jews back to Judaism at a time of great cultural assimilation. So how you're going to make your little school for prophets when all the Jews are so culturally assimilated that they don't know anything about Judaism anymore. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you. I have to tell you a story, so it's a really bizarre story. I was once in an old Hebrew bookstore on the Lower East Side. These things don't exist anymore, like they did. And I'm walking around this bookstore looking for rare books, and a chassid comes in, and he's carrying a big briefcase. They're always carrying big briefcases full of stuff. And he's says, what about my book? Why don't you buy my book? I said, what's your book? He says, oh, I translated the Guide of the Perplexed, the Maimonides, the Rabbis, looking back into the original. I said, into Arabic? He says, no, into the original. It was written in Arabic. I said, what do you mean into the original? It was in Arabic. He said, no. You think such a frum Jew as the Rambam would write a book in such a language, Arabic, the language of Goyim, language of Arabs, language of Muslims? I said, well, what is the original language of the Shulchan Aruch? He says, what a question, Yiddish. So he pulls out this tome from his briefcase and he says, here's Martin looking in Yiddish, the original language. The Rambam wrote it. I says, well, how come if Maimonides wrote the Guide of the Perplexed in Yiddish, nobody knows it? And every scholar in the world says it was originally written in Arabic. He says, you see, in Maimonides' time, the Jews, they were all like you, assimilated. So the Rambam knew that if he published the Gemara Nevuchim in Yiddish, the Jews were so assimilated they didn't know Yiddish, they couldn't read it. They couldn't write it in Hebrew, they didn't know Hebrew, so sure they couldn't read it. So the Rambam, he was smart, he translated it into Arabic. And then the Jews who were so assimilated like you, they couldn't read it. But all these years, it's not been available in the original. And now I have spent 10 years translating it into Yiddish, the original.
Did you buy it?
No, I didn't have room. I mean, it's enough in Central, in Times Square, that Jews for Jesus are giving you for free. You don't even have to buy it. The New Testament in Yiddish. I once had a New Year's Eve party, and we were looking for something to do. I don't drink, but all these people were drinking. And they said, let's do something strange. I said, how about if we all read the New Testament in Yiddish? So we did. It was so hilarious.
Was it well translated, or did they mess up?
Well, we didn't get through very much. We got through a few chapters of Matthew, and Matthew is the most Jewish of the Gospels, and you could practically translate it into Aramaic, and it would fit. The rest is all this Greek text stuff, especially the Gospel of John, with the Word of God. But Matthew is a very Jewish book, so Matthew we had no problem. Matthew fit very well in Yiddish. So these are his problems. How you bring Jews back to Judaism in an age of cultural assimilation, an age when there's little knowledge of Judaism. How do you deal with the relationship of halacha to its theological and moral premises? And how do you express, which was a big personal problem for Maimonides, how do you express individual genius in opposition to a bureaucratic Jewish leadership? So Heschel deals with all of these problems in his book on Maimonides. Rather than, dealing as most scholars do, well, here's Maimonides' view of God, and here's Maimonides' view of the predication of divine attributes, and here's Maimonides' view of the problem of evil. Heschel deals today with the problem of evil, not as an abstract issue, but how did Maimonides' view of the problem of evil change from his commentary to the Mishnah, which is his earliest important work, to his Guide of the Perplexed, which is his later important work, due to the loss of his brother. In other words, what's going on in Maimonides' inner spiritual life that led to the development of certain ideas in his thinking, rather than, just deal with the abstract universal categories. So you have a very, very unique, very different study of Maimonides than you have in most of the other books on Maimonides. However, because he wrote it in such haste, and not as an end in itself, I think that, if he had time, or had lived longer, maybe that was one of the books he would have, I would say, he would have finished. Because I don't think that the German version was actually finished, because there was a lot more to flesh out. But already there you see him suggesting that Maimonides, who was considered the paradigmatic Jewish model for all modern Jews, because he was a bicultural superstar. He wasn't a parochial Jew. He wasn't, rigid. He had a lot of faults, but he was like the paradigm for modern Jews, being successful both as a Jew and being successful in a non-Jewish culture, being successful as a physician, a scientist. He became a paradigm. Heschel says, but the problem is that Maimonides, who was the greatest Jewish thinker of all times, according to many scholars, was not really a Jewish thinker, because his basic categories are not Jewish categories, and particularly his idea of prophecy. So his life's project is based on a mistake. Now, what's the mistake? The mistake, Heschel says in many places, is the fundamental mistake upon which all Western theology is based. Now, the first great Western theologian is who?
Jesus?
Who?
Aquinas?
No.
According to whom?
Aquinas.
I don't
Already
know.
after Maimonides.
Plato.
Wow.
Socrates. Aristotle.
Sajika.
Jewish.
Oh,
Sajika.
Jew-
Om.
He
Side-
doesn't have to be Jewish, sorry. But he happens to be Jewish.
Sajika Om.
No, long before Sajigon.
Philo.
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 Philo of Alexandria, 1st century BC. Philo of Alexandria is considered the first Western theologian. He had this great 2-volume work on his ideas by the late Professor Harry Wolfson of Harvard. Because he was the first one who attempted to do what so many people attempted to do after him. And that is to say that you have on the one hand philosophical thought, and on the other hand, let's call it Hebraic thought. And they both really say the same thing in different ways. And what you have to do is to show that that's the case. So Philo says there's philosophical thought, which in his case meant basically Plato, and there's Hebraic thought, which in his case, for the Talmud, meant basically the Bible. And he tries to show that they're saying the same things in two different ways, but they agree on it, basically. Maimonides, much later on, tries to do the same thing with Aristotle and rabbinic tradition. Mordecai Kaplan, much later on, tries to do the same thing with philosophy of John Dewey and the sociology of Emil Durkheim and American pragmatism and the history of Jewish thought. Hermann Cohen tries to do the same thing in the 19th century, early 20th century with Neo-Kantian thought and Jewish thought. So Heschel says if you look, and in Christian tradition, the same thing. That, let's say, Aquinas tries to do the same thing, say, Aristotle and the church fathers are saying the same thing, but in different languages. And the Arabs too, the Muslims too. Avicenna and Averroes and all the other great Muslim thinkers are trying to show that a certain philosophy, school of philosophy, and certain school of religious thought are saying the same thing. Now, what Heshcel argues is that unless you recognize that the categories of Jewish thought, or Hebraic thought, or biblical thought, or whatever you want to call it, are totally different than the categories of Western philosophical thought coming out of ancient Greek thought, particularly Aristotelian thought, unless you recognize that they're totally different, you're going to make the mistake that Philo began, and you're going to perpetuate it, which is to try to show that the two are saying the same thing. And you're going to try to make a hybrid out of two things that are incompatible. And when you do that, you're going to distort not only one of them, but you're going to distort both of them. And if you're going to try to show how Judaism is relevant to the current trend in Western philosophical thought, it's the Jewish part that's going to be the most distorted. So Heschel comes to the conclusion that the whole history of Western theology, starting with Philo down to our own day, is predicated on a mistake. And therefore, in order to, I hate to use the term, press the reset button, in order to press the reset button, what you have to do is to answer the question, which is, as I discussed before, is Heschel's major question: what is authentic Jewish thought? And once you ask that question, you see very clearly that it cannot be the hybrid. It cannot be the attempt to put together these two things that don't fit together. And once you do that, you're on a totally different quest than if your search is for identifying what is authentic Jewish thinking. You're on a totally different quest than if you're searching for some kind of way of proving that two incompatible ways of thinking are, in fact, compatible. And therefore, what Maimonides is doing, and according to Heschel, in his idea of prophecy, is trying to put together biblical prophecy and Aristotelian views of human perfection, which are contradictory. And therefore, Maimonides' quest is really an authentic Jewish quest, because the prophecy that he's seeking to restore is not the prophecy, the Jewish prophecy that was lost, but is a figment of the Aristotelian mind. Mr. Zola?
Is it possible that all these attempts come from a sense of insecurity, and it's really apologetic to?
Yes, absolutely.
And the reason, is it possible that the reason Heschel didn't buy into that also is because he wasn't insecure and he didn't feel like, or didn't think that the Jewish categories in the Jewish religion was inferior and needed to create an apologetic that it was at least as good as Aristotelian logic or Kantian logic or anything else?
Yes, absolutely. In other words, I would say that what we call Jewish philosophy, particularly medieval Jewish philosophy and some modern Jewish philosophy, is really not philosophy, it's apologetics. So the question is, then why take it seriously and why let it influence what Judaism is? But because he knew what the authentic thing was, he could identify it. Most people couldn't. And maybe he took this position because he was, to use the term, it's politically incorrect today, a Jewish intellectual chauvinist. That Judaism was the better one. Now, Sela Baron wrote a lot about this in his work on Jewish history, in which he discusses what he calls the Jewish pygmy approach. Namely that in his day, in the early 20th century, says if you look at many of the Jewish histories of the 19th century, you see the view that the Jews are always viewed as pygmies, and their ideas are always viewed as inferior to the general culture. And there's no reason we should claim that. Why can't we claim that they took their stuff from us and that our stuff is superior anyway? And now you have a kind of trend toward this idea becoming more acceptable. Let me give you an example, since you raised it. Years ago, I had Fidel teaching in our doctoral program, so he used to come here every summer. So I introduced him to a number of rabbis in town, and one of the rabbis in town says to him, because he knew, Israeli scholars, they're always looking for money, American money. He says to him, are you looking for any money? It's a stupid question. He says, yeah, I want to publish such and such a book. I need to raise such and such an amount. And so this rabbi says that it was on Jews in the Renaissance. Jews in Renaissance thought, something like that. So this rabbi says, okay, I'm going to invite some of my wealthy lay people, and we're going to have a luncheon, and you make a little presentation, and then I'll make a little presentation, and then we'll, as the saying goes, make the ask. So they go to this fancy private Jewish club. Fidel even wears a tie, which he didn't own. I had to lend it to him. And he has this lunch. He's sitting there. This rabbi is sitting there, well-intentioned. I'm sitting there. And this very wealthy lady, who was one of this rabbi's main targets, says, why should we fund your work on these Kabbalists, just like these Kabbalists? What do they contribute to world culture? And then she has to show you how smart she is. So she says, and I am taking a course in the extension program of the University of Chicago on Renaissance thought. And we are studying the great Renaissance thinkers like Marcello Ficino and Pico de Mirandola and people like this. And how does your Rabbi Jonathan Alamano that you want us to pay for your study, and this Kabbalist and that Kabbalist in Italy, how do they stack up? No one's ever heard of them. Isn't it more important to know these great Renaissance thinkers? And Hidel says to this lady, madam, what all the great Italian Renaissance thinkers that you mentioned have in common is they all had Kabbalists for tutors. And you can't understand Marcello Ficino or Pico de Mirandola thought unless you understand the Kabbalistic motifs in it that they learned from their tutor, who happened to have been Jonathan Alamano. Game, set, point, but he didn't get the money. So this is the more current approach. That we don't need to borrow, we don't need to have this pygmy approach, because what we, a great value in and of itself. And Baron, argued against very strenuously throughout his whole life, and he was the greatest Jewish historian of the 20th century, what he called the Lacrimos theory of Jewish history. In other words, the view that all of Jewish history is just the vale of tears. One tragedy, one massacre, one this after the other. And he said, you know, it's maybe a very good strategy to win sympathy from the non-Jews. It's maybe a very good strategy to win sympathy for Israel, or whatever you want. But was it true? I said, yes, we had a lot of the tragedies. But while all this was going on for thousands of years, we created a culture. He said, and the culture is unrivaled. For example, he says, the Christians, when they talk about history, they talk about the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages, it was so dark, there was no culture, nothing was going on, people couldn't read, people, were dying of the plague and everything was terrible. And what were the Jews doing in Babylonia and today Iraq in the Dark Ages? They produced this work called the Talmud. There's nothing like it in the world, such a literature. There are other religious literatures, but nothing like Talmud. And what did they have? The Dark Ages. So we produced. We were our creative civilization. So why should we put ourselves second, to the others? In modern thought, who are the people who more influence modern thought than anybody else? They all happen to be Jews almost. Freud, Marx, Jews. Einstein, Jews. Who's the first American winner of the Nobel Prize for Science? Michelson from the University of Chicago. Jews. So why should we, so Byron argues, so why should we take this pygmy approach? Why should we take this Lacrimos approach? We should rather celebrate what we've achieved. And I would say that Heshcel is also, not as overtly as Byron, but is expressing this view. In an interview he gave to the Yiddish newspaper, I think it was the Morgen Journal in 1963, he says, why are we, he calls it Jews the plate lickers of Western civilization? Why are we licking their plates when we have our own stuff? And you have phrases that crept into his book on this, and the earth is the Lord's. We saw the emblazoned lights of the great metropolis, the great cities of Europe, but we forgot about our own eternal light that shows us wisdom in the darkness and stuff like this. So this is his view. And further his view, as I said before, is that it's precisely these views in our tradition that can help the human situation now, and not only the Jewish situation. So that's why it's important to be able to identify what are the authentic Jewish ideas and how they can be implemented to impact on society. I mean, let me end with this one thought. Most modern Jewish thinkers tried to take Judaism and make it universal ethical and philosophical ideas. They tried to universalize Judaism rather than admit the particularity of Judaism, the individual uniqueness of Judaism. So they went from the individual, they went from the particular to the universal. What Heshcel tries to do is to take the particular ideas of Judaism, you might say that even the parochial ideas of Judaism, and show their universalistic implications. So, for example, he doesn't try to take a universalistic view and impose it on how we deal with the war in Vietnam or how we deal with civil rights. He takes, let's say with civil rights, this idea of the exile of God, Galut Hashtinah, a very particularistic, Kabbalistic idea, and applies it to a universal issue of ethics. Whereas most Jews take the view of Lemkin, who was the founder of the word genocide, that there are certain universal rights, and that Jewish ideas are all particularistic, so they have no relationship, no relevance to this. Heschel says, no, what we have is particularistic, but it has universalistic implications. This is the opposite way that most most people have taken. Okay.